Hey gang, Brian Martin, the boss man, coming at you today from Four State Trucks headquarters. Today I got Michael Forrest, our top tech, out here in the shop. Of course, you can see the old Ranch Hand 389 behind us, and we're getting ready for, we'll call it Project 1 or Episode 1 of many that we're going to do together on this truck. As we showed you in the initial walk around, and you'll see here shortly, this 389 is equipped with factory air ride suspension on the steer axle. Well, what's every 389 owner that's got an air ride front axle want to do?
They want to dump it.
They want to get the truck lower. So there's various methods out there that you can do that with. Most of them pretty intensive, you know, 16, 18, 19 hours labor. A lot of reconfiguration of components that relate to the front end of the truck. And in most cases, not all, you kind of lose a little bit of that factory drivability. You know, that old one-finger steering is kind of what you have now and what you want to keep. So our new gen drop suspension kit that we carry here at Four State, the kit looks pretty robust. I mean, obviously we've got our bags, we've got our top brackets, bottom brackets, spring hangers, shackle kits. I even see some new shocks over there.
New shocks. This kit has a steering stabilizer in it. Included in the kit.
Yeah.
Leveling valves. There's a electric solenoid here for dumping the front end.
So we got an electric deflate, a good assortment of hoses, fittings, things like that. It is a 2 leveling valve system, which has a lot of appeal. And everything here is in the box. It is going to need painted. The customer is going to have to paint it the color of his chassis. We kind of cheated and painted a little bit of this ahead of time, but essentially everything you're going to need within reason is in the box. So here in a day or so, we'll have this new gen installed, and of course, we want to go from this junk bumper to a 20-inch bumper that we've got over here. So let's go take a look at our stainless front bumper. So we've got a 20-inch tapered up to a 19, boxed in, and don't laugh, but we got 2 round fog light holes. And it wouldn't be complete without having either some kind of a flip kit or a lift kit. In this case, we're going to go with the lift kit that we've got here. We're also going to get it painted black to match the frame. All right, well, let's start tearing this thing down and we'll get to work.
So this is our factory setup here. Got dual airbags, a leveling valve on each side, of course shock here in between the bags. 1 single leaf spring with a long shackle hanger. We won't have to remove this leaf spring at all. Not have to remove any springs from it. Everything's going to stay there. We will have to change this hanger to a shorter hanger. That'll let this spring come up higher towards the frame, obviously lowering the frame, the axle. The airbag's bolted on here. This is a mount where the new airbag brackets will go. The airbag will sit about where the shock is, and a leveling valve attached up here above it. Again, it'll be 1 on each side. Shocks coming behind it, similar to the old style. A single shock on this one, not a dual shock. Be a steering stabilizer that'll attach to the bottom of the U-bolts, and it'll be basically a shock that runs parallel to the axle, and it'll clamp around the tie rod here, a little more towards the center of the truck. Help take some of the shimmy and shake out of them. All right, so before we begin our teardown, I want to go ahead and close the hood and get some preliminary measurements. I want to measure how high the fender is from the ground, maybe how high the bumper is from the ground. Not that we need those measurements, but it's good to know how much we've dropped it. Put on a few points there. There, 44 3/8, 28 7/8. Yeah, see, here's something to notice. This side is 29 1/8. So over here, just from one side of the grill to the other side, we've got a 1/4 inch of lean, at least in the hood, maybe not in the frame or maybe not in the bumper, but we do there. So that's a good thing to note, that after we put this kit on and we measure our sides again, maybe we're still a 1/4 inch high on this side, and instead of looking for what we may have done wrong, well, we know that's something to do with the frame is maybe a little bit higher on one side than the other, or whatever the case is, but we can eliminate our work. And this fender is 45 1/4. I think the other side was 44 3/8. So even up here we've got Make sure his hood's down all the way. Yep. We've got 7/8 of an inch higher at the fender. That's it's not uncommon. Most new trucks, you can measure them anywhere and they're not going to be straight, level from one end to the other. So not really concerned about it, but it's nice to know that we have this amount of offset before we start. So my first step is just pull the front bumper off and get that out of our way. So to remove this factory 12-inch bumper, it has no braces on the bottom like most of your 18s and 20s and such do. So all I've got are these 4 bolts here in the front, and they've got nuts welded into the framework on the back side, so we don't have to get a wrench or anything. We'll just take an impact and buzz these 4 bolts out and get this bumper out of our way. Luckily this isn't too heavy. So I'm going to start prepping and putting some paint on our parts here. This is a pretty good layout of what we have for one side. At least this part's going to get painted. There's an airbag obviously and shocks that aren't here. But this is our upper airbag bracket using existing holes in the frame. This is our lower airbag bracket. These here will have these U-bolts going through it into the axle. The airbag will sit here slightly behind it. We're going to replace the shackle hanger on the rear. And here's our new longer shackles. Be a shorter shackle hanger, but longer shackles, so will be approximately the same height to start with. U-bolts for the axle, and this is the steering stabilizer mount. This here will go underneath the U-bolts here, and this end here will attach to that tie rod with some U-bolts on it, and it'll be of course stud here and stud here for the stabilizer to attach to. So I'll start getting these sanded down with a wire brush and Scotch-Brite pad. These are raw steel. Everything in here is raw steel when you get it, except for the shocks and the steering stabilizer. So if you don't have some paint on this before you put it on here, like for example, if you try to paint this after you install it all, the back side of your airbag bracket is going to be raw steel, and it's going to start rusting in a week or two. And it's heavy steel, it's not going to rust out and fall apart on you, but you're going to have rust streaks running down your frame, across all your components. So that's why we like to paint all our components before we put them on, so you can cover 100% of the area. This truck's got a black frame. We're going to use some aerosol black paint. You could do it any color you wanted, but you know, everybody wants it to be color matched to their frame. So whatever you got, you can usually get that found in an aerosol color, especially mixed. You could have it powder coated, you could have it shot by a professional painter, whichever. But since ours is just black, we're just going to use some good aerosol gloss black paint. Alright, we'll get that time to dry. I'm going to turn them over and paint the bottom sides of them. Alright, well, now I need to get the truck up in the air, and the best way we have to do that is to put these wheel jacks under the front axle. So I'll get these put underneath both steer tires, and I'll open the hood before I get it up in the air. I'll lift it a couple of feet and I'll put the jack stands under the frame, because I'll have to remove the rear spring shackles, so the front axle will have to be able to swing down. So you can hear the air bleeding off here, and the reason it's doing that is the axle has changed height compared to the frame, so the leveling valve is trying to dump the air out of the bags, trying to lower the truck, but of course we've got jack stands, so it's not going to happen. It'll sit here and run until it deflates all the air out of the system, trying to lift it when it has no change in the height. So I just want to check my jack stands, make sure they're good and solid. I think I'll probably start by getting the leveling valve off, probably then the shock, and then work my way in here. Looks like the leveling valve mounted with the airbag bolts up here and the lower shock mount down at the bottom. Go ahead and remove the supply line. Be reusing this supply on the new leveling valves. I believe that this bag is just kind of locked into the base at the bottom, so just a little quick turn, just like a bottle cap, and it comes right off. Let me go ahead and pull the shock off next. Give me a little more room to get to that airbag. All these parts I'm pulling off will not be reused, so we can just set them aside out of our way. Okay, and this is the stop for the suspension. that limits the travel of the axle coming up, you know, on hitting bumps and whatnot. Keep the axle from getting into an oil pan or something. So this will need to go also. So I've got the airbags, leveling valves, shocks, and the suspension stop removed from both sides. So the first thing I'll do here is remove these 4 bolts that capture the spring pin in the shackles and in the hanger. Then I can pull the shackles off each side. And I may have to let this jack down a little bit to take the tension off of it. There shouldn't be much on it. I may have to play with it a little bit to get it to where it eases off. All right, these shackles ought to tap right off of there. Keep my fingers clear just in case the spring tries to flop a little bit. I'll go ahead and pull the other side off now. All right, these ought to tap off. This being a brand new truck, they're coming right off. If you've got one with some age or some miles on it, they may be a little more stuck. It might take a little bit more hammering to get them off. All right, so I'm gonna take my 15/16 and take these hangers off here now. These are a difficult reach around the frame. So we got here our original hanger and shackles next to our replacement hanger and shackles. As you can see, there's a large difference in the size of the hanger and the shackles, and overall it's like we're about 2 inches or so shorter. Our longer shackles are going to help it move more freely. Also, the pin through the shackles and through the hanger does not come installed, so you'll need to put that into here. I've got it greased up and installed in here, but as you'll notice, there is a threaded hole in one end of this pin. That's for a grease zerk, and that end needs to be away from the frame. If we have it put in here with a hole to the inside, when you get your truck serviced, they will probably not see that grease zerk, and they won't be greasing your shackles like they need to be. Putting on new nuts on these, new lock nuts on these. Get my pin and put in there, greased up. That looks about even right there. Now I'll lift the axle up and I'll raise the spring up to about where it needs to be, and then each side I'll put the inner and outer shackles over them. Now let's just go until the large diameter of the pin is roughly flush with this shackle in order for that cutaway to line up with the bolt hole through here. There, just like that. There we go. I'll just leave those loose for the time being. All right, so we got the driver's side hooked up. Now I'll go ahead and come to the passenger side and do it the exact same way. Beautiful. Beautiful. I'll tighten all these up. Now those are all mounted. It's time to put our grease zerk in and grease it while we're thinking about it so we don't forget about this little detail. So I'll put it up here, pointed forward. A mechanic would have no problem getting a grease hose hooked onto it up here. If we had it pointed up towards this filter housing or maybe towards the rear, it'd make it a lot more difficult for a grease gun to get on it. Turn this one as much as I can the same direction. Yep, I feel like that's tight right there. And we'll go ahead and get some grease in there on both of these. So I got our new shackles and hangers installed on here. Springs hooked back up. My next step will be to remove these original airbag mounts from the top of the spring. All right, so now here's our, remove our lower airbag mount. And now we're done taking anything apart here. We don't need to touch this spring, anything else in here. Our new bracket and airbag will just sit right on top of this as it is. So this is our passenger side lower airbag bracket. In this slot right here is where the bottom stud of the airbag will sit. Our U-bolts will go in right here, right in through the axle. Now before we put this onto here, we need to put the front U-bolt in for certain. Our airbag sits on there. And you see it's got our slot here, it's also got a cutaway, enough room for this nut to set into it and recess below the height of this. After this is tightened down, you'll see that the stud is still a little bit higher than this mount, and that's going to sit on top of the spring that's there. What we got to do is grind down any bit of that stud that sticks out lower than this, because all the weight will be coming onto where that stud is attached to the airbag rather than onto the base of the bag itself. So I'll get a socket, we'll tighten that nut up on there. Alright, that's tight. Now you can see if you look flush across this line right here, how this stud protrudes lower than what the base is. We got to cut all that excess off so all of our weight is coming onto the bracket and not down onto the stud itself. So I'll take a grinder and cut the excess of that off. I'll just bring this in. Let the U-bolt drop into that hole. Now set our front U-bolt on. And on this side here, we'll have just the nuts and washers on the front. On the rear is where the steering stabilizer will go. So I'll go ahead and mount that lower bracket for the steering stabilizer here while I'm doing this. Yep, that looks right. Alright, there's that. There's a stud for our stabilizer. It'll sit parallel to the tie rod here, and the other end will clamp around it somewhere in about this neighborhood here. So let me go ahead and get the other side put together. And alright, we run these nuts down. I'll kind of alternate how I tighten them down, pull them down evenly across here. Solid. Alright, so now we've got our airbags and brackets all mounted. I'll take our upper bracket and set them on over the top of the airbag each side, and then lift that truck up until my airbag comes up to the bottom of the frame. That way I can get the height of this exactly, so I've got a straight line from the bottom of this bracket across the bottom of the frame, so the airbag has one wide solid mount to go to. Looks like right there. All right, so now I've got my 4 holes lined up here. I've got 4 5/8 by 2-inch bolts. Get those all mounted in there. Get washers and lock nuts on the inside. We'll get my other side in now. I raise my axle to make sure that my airbag is bottomed out against the bottom of the frame. Yep, it wasn't quite there. Now I believe it is. All right, so you can see here that our holes are about a half a hole off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this airbag. I may need to let it down a little bit to do this, but I'm going to rotate the airbag. That'll make this nipple move forward, moving the bracket with it and bring our holes closer together. So we got a little ahead of ourselves here. We do have a bracket for the leveling valve to mount, and it'll go into the second to rear mounting hole for the bracket and up here to the top hole where the original stop and shock mount used to go. It'll set in here like this. This is where the valve will mount, and that little bit of angled cut there is to allow that valve to be adjusted to set your ride height. So we'll pull this bolt out, put it through here, put a new bolt into the top with some included spacers. These are some stainless steel washers behind there to keep this parallel to the frame and not trying to bend over at the top like this. All right, so now we've got our airbags mounted, brackets mounted, leveling valve bracket mounted. I'm going to go ahead and put our retaining nuts on the nipple of the airbag. Of course, there's one on each side. I'll get a wrench and I'll tighten that up. So I'm going to lay out some tape on the frame so I can use a marker to mark where the shock wants to sit. Here on the driver's side, there's a lot more things on the frame that kind of interfere with where this can go, so it'll be a lot more limiting to us. I can lay this out on this side and transfer it to there and feel pretty confident that there's nothing in the way. Of course, we'll double check all that. And that will be somewhere in this area right here. So right now this is sitting here with this airbag bottomed out. This is as low as it can possibly go. And we don't want to have the shock bottom out right now also. So what I'll do is I'll make sure it's at the bottom of its travel, and I'll pull it up about a ½ inch. That way when this is dumped or hitting bumps, something should happen, we know we're not going to bottom out the shock and possibly break a stud off of it. So I'm going to set this back at about 30 degrees or so. I know on the other side there's an air conditioner line that runs right up here about where the top of this tape is. So I want to stay down a couple inches from the top of the frame. I'm just going to find a spot that looks good. Put a mark there. And I'll take a measurement off a point, like the back side of this leveling valve bracket to that point, and from the top of the frame down to there. Lay that point out on that side of the frame, put the shock there, and make sure everything is good. 9 3/4 back. We're about 2 3/4. So I'll lay these out 9 3/4 back from the same point on that mount, and 2 3/4 down from the top of the frame. Now see if this airbag is, or this shock is completely collapsed, it's going to hit that point. So obviously a difference between one side to the next here. So I'll make a point probably another 1.5 inches back to make sure that this here will clear. So I know my height is about where I need to be. I can't get any higher than that. So I'm just going to move straight back. We'll probably go to, let's say 11 1/4. About 2 3/4. Yep, this here will be fine. Our lube location is good. Nothing else in the way. And I'll be pulled up about a 1/2 inch off the bottom of the shock. So let me just put that mark on the other side, and if everything's good, we'll drill our studs there. Bottom of shock out. Yeah, pull it up about a 1/2 inch. Yeah, that'll work. So this is where we'll drill a 3/4 inch hole for our top shock stud. So now we're going to drill the hole in the frame for our top shock stud. I'm going to use this electromagnet frame drill. This I can cut a 3/4 inch hole in one shot through there. Of course, you don't need to use this. You could use a cordless drill, air drill, whatever. Just have to be cautious, because right behind this hole, or where this hole will be, is wires, air lines, fuel lines, all sorts of stuff is right back here. So you would definitely want to put something on your drill bit to keep you from going through very far. Obviously, you're going to start with, you know, 1/4 inch or smaller bit for a pilot, and step up from there. This is about 5/16 through thickness steel, so it'll take several passes to get through it. But we'll go through it with our frame drill in one shot, and we'll be good to go soon. So there we got both our upper shock stud holes drilled. These are the only 2 holes that we've drilled in the frame. Everything else has used existing holes from the original air ride system. We got 1 hole here in the frame we put a bolt in to fill it. All right, so now we've got our shock stud holes drilled on each side. This is our shock stud for the upper part. The long end with the smooth shaft and the fine threads will be to the outside of the frame where our shock will sit. The shorter end with the coarse threads will go through the frame, and we'll put a lock nut on it there. Alright, so remember that extra hole we had? We need to put a bolt and nut in that hole to fill it. So I'm just putting a 5/8 short nut and bolt in here. Alright, so now we're going to mock up our leveling valve and our airbag fittings and get all of our fittings set where they need to be before we make a permanent installation of these. What we've got here is the fitting that'll go on top of the nipple on the airbag. It's got a flared fitting here that'll mate to that flared fitting on the nipple, and then a pipe thread in on this end, which will accept a brass fitting with our 1/4 inch air line. So here's our bottom leveling valve rod stud. The upper part of the rod will attach to this arm on the leveling valve. We've got, you can see it marked C1 and C2. That's the outputs that would go to the airbags. We're going to plug one of them, since we're only going to have one fitting going to one airbag. This end here is marked I and E. That's intake and exhaust, and that's just going to depend on how those valves position, which one we use. We got 1 round hole and 1 curved slotted hole for the 2 studs on the leveling valve. They'll fit in there like that, and then you can adjust the angle of this valve to adjust the ride height. So we know we need to plug one of the outputs. That one marked C1 faces down. We won't use it. So again, this is all just temporary. We'll take these apart, put some sealer on these before we call it finished. We'll have 1 fitting in here. It'll go out to the airbag. It'll probably point that direction. This one here will be our supply. This is actual air supply, not the dump supply. We'll make it just turn 180 of that one so the lines don't interfere. And this is where our power their air supply for the dump is going to come from. And this will be from your dash switch or your solenoid or wherever you decide to get your pressure from the dump switch turned on. On the opposite side of our inlet, here's our nipple for our vent, and then a short piece of hose I'll put on there. This will sit on here just like that, and you kind of see that our lines are got to be here where they are to reach our output here. We'll probably make a U-turn to get to the, we might turn this one around backward. We'll just make a U-turn this way. Come here, we'll make a loop to that. This is our supply from our original leveling valve. We'll have to lengthen this, obviously. We'll run it to this port up here, and when I get our dump line ran, it'll go to this port. So now we take us over to the workbench, put our thread sealant on all these ports, screw these in, and make this solid. Alright, and there's that one. Now we're ready to mount this onto the truck. I'll insert the studs into the holes. There are lock nuts on them with the flat washers. For the time being, I'm just going to make this parallel to the frame. It's kind of in the middle of its travel. And we'll adjust on it as needed. Alright, now let's go get our other side put together, get it mocked. Now we'll start putting our lines on. This here is the supply line from the original leveling valve. So that's what we'll use to feed this one. We'll probably need to cut some length of it off since the other valve was mounted further back. I'll go right about there. Put it into our compression fitting, the ferrule on it, and that'll slide over that insert, and then goes into the fitting about that far. And our nut down. Tighten this up. This also is just compressing that ferrule on that line. It's not pipe thread. It doesn't have to be torqued as tight as you can possibly turn it. And start feeling some resistance on it as it's compressing that brass ferrule. Then it'll get to a point that it gets really snug. Cut off the excess loom. Alright, well, there's that part. Next line will be the one I build from the output of the leveling valve, making a loop here to the airbag. If I make it too tight, I may try to kink the line, so I'll leave a little bit of excess length there. You have room for it to bend without kinking. I won't hook this one up yet until I get my dump circuit ran out here. So let me go ahead and put the little plastic tube on the vent. This is where the air gets exhausted when you dump the front end or the leveling valve tells you it's too high. It'll bleed out through that hole there. There's no pressure on here. It just exhausts the air out. I may cut that a little bit shorter too. Alright, so we've got our leveling valves mounted. We've got our air supply plumbed to the valve and the outlet from the valve to the airbag. Next is to install this electric solenoid inside this toolbox to supply pressure to the dump portion of that valve. We're going to mount this box inside of here, run an air supply from this tank, and it'll come out of this valve, tee off, one side going to each valve, but we'll need to figure out which ports we're going to use and which ones we need to plug, and then get it mounted in this box. Now, this valve has a lot of ports that we don't need to do anything with. This P is our pressure, our supply. Right now, with no power onto it, this is open to port marked A, so airflow would be just blowing right through here. This one over here, this marked B, when you energize this solenoid, the spool moves and air pressure comes from the P to the B terminal. That's the one I want my supply to be to the leveling valves to come from. So put a fitting into P to go to the air tank. I'll put these fittings in pointed perpendicular to the valve because I'll mount this to the back wall of the box. This way my air lines can come out and loop back through the hole. And a fitting into B to go to the leveling valve. And I'll put a plug in A so that I'm not losing air when the switch is not engaged. These ones marked R and S, what they do is they are intended to exhaust the pressure off of the port when it's turned off. And then wire for the solenoid. The black will be grounded. I usually just ground it right to the box or to the solenoid itself. And this one here will come from our switch. So I'll remove our toolbox lid. You can see we got a lot of room to work. If you had a box full of other components, or if you had a DPF here, this could be mounted anywhere. You could put it into the driver's side battery box, you could mount it on the firewall. I just try to keep it somewhere that it's out of the weather and protected as possible. And our two unused ports here, I try to keep these pointed downward just to keep dust and debris and stuff from settling in them. This valve will operate regardless of how it's positioned, upside down, flipped around, anything. So I've got to just position this in a suitable spot here on the box, mark my holes and drill them. All right, so I got my solenoid ready to mount, and before I go ahead and do that, I'm gonna put a ring terminal on the ground wire for this and mount it right to the body of that, and that'll ground through the chassis. All right, so I got my plug out of the back of the box. I'm gonna put a hole through there and put this grommet into it and run all our wires and air lines through it. Next, I'll remove this plug from the air tank to get my supply to that, and it's probably still full of air. No, it must have drained all out already. Good deal. So now I'll just take this 1/2-inch pipe plug out. Now I've got a fitting with our 1/2-inch pipe thread to our 1/4-inch air line. Put that in that port. As far as routing our air line, in order to keep it clean and away from the exhaust, anything moving, I'm going to run it up toward the top of the frame and run down here behind the air tank to the bottom of the box, and then come through this hole right here. Okay. Now our supply is routed. Next will be the line coming from the solenoid to the T that'll split off to each leveling valve. So for the line coming out to the leveling valves, I'm going to come out of that solenoid through that hole, up the frame to somewhere up into this neighborhood on the side of the engine. Then we'll have a T that'll reach off. I'm going to run this line down to attach to this air conditioner line, and before it goes to this fitting, and the driver's side will run over the engine along the top of the frame, possibly outside the frame, possibly inside, and into the same port. Okay, let me go ahead and put some wire loom over that and start securing it to the firewall and along the lines. This is all secure now. The lines are pretty solid. There's no excess slack hanging on anywhere for anything moving to get caught on or get pulled tight, so we're good like this. Alright, so our next step is to assemble our leveling valve rod. It'll attach from the bottom stud here on the airbag bracket up to a bolt that we're going to put in this end of the leveling valve. We got the stainless steel rod and these rubber ends. We just need to slide them together. We'll have to get this length figured when we get our ride height set. It's adjustable just with a couple of hose clamps. We'll clamp each end onto here. So we'll get those put on. Alright, so I got a rod assembled, ready to put it onto the brackets. The end here with a single round eyelet goes to the bottom, and the end that the rod passes through goes through the top. I put some WD-40 on this rubber. It makes it slide on and off the studs a whole lot easier. I'll just put a washer on that bottom bolt, push that through, another washer on, and a lock nut. Tighten this nut up. It doesn't need to be very tight. It just needs to be able to keep the rod from falling off, basically. So, in order for this rod to be practically straight up and down, it's going to be the inside of the arm. It could possibly go either way, but it looks much better this way. I'm going to take my bolt and a washer, and pass it through the rubber. Another washer on it, and a regular nut. Again, this part does not need to be tight. This bolt will actually turn a little bit in there as this moves up and down. Kind of put that through the hole on the end of the arm. I run a lock nut over the top of it. That'll keep that bolt straight instead of trying to tip as it's traveling. Install my bottom end first. The washer, the boot, another washer, and a lock nut. I'm gonna take my bolt with the washer on it through the hole. Another washer, a regular hex nut, through the arm, and a lock nut. Okay, now we're going to adjust for our ride height to get our leveling valve set. So what I'm looking for is 2.5 inches from the top of this base where the shock mount is to the bottom of the frame. I can see here that I've got right at 3 inches. So I'm going to lift our jacks up a little higher, compress this bag a little bit more. There we are, there's our 2.5 inches. So now what I'm going to do is loosen these two clamps and move this arm down on this rod until this arm is parallel with these sides of the valve. That's the neutral position for this valve. A little too far. Right there looks even, and I can do some finer adjustments by angling this valve with the slotted hole in the back of that bracket. This side is actually below 2.5, so I'm going to lower this side down. There we are, about 2.5 right there. I'll need to adjust this one also. So now I've got my initial 2.5 inches of clearance set in here. I'm going to go ahead and install the shocks. I'm going to go ahead and put the steering stabilizer on the tie rod, get those all buttoned up, then I'm going to lower the truck down to the ground, build up some air pressure, let this system work and let it lift the truck, and double check my ride height clearance and adjust this valve as necessary to get that 2.5 inches that I'm looking for. So I've just kind of pre-fit the shock on these studs, and in order to keep the shock straight up and down without binding in the bushings, I'm going to have to shim the shock away from the stud by about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch on the top. The bottom is bottomed out against the bracket, so I'll stack some washers in here and then put my nuts and washers on the outside. I'm also going to go ahead and put some anti-seize on this stud. That'll help keep the steel from rusting and kind of locking that shock on there, so when it comes time for somebody to change the shock, this will come off there without having to beat and pry it off. I'll put a washer on the outside and our fine thread lock nuts on here. With that just tight enough to keep the shock in place, it's got to be able to move and compress it a little bit, and I don't want to stretch out and crush those bushings. Now put the shock on. Now our shocks are on. I'm going to put the steering stabilizer on now. So here's our steering stabilizer, and it's just like the shock absorber. It's got a rod inside this cylinder. What I need to do is pull this rod all the way out, measure the amount of travel that it has, and push it back in half of that travel so that it's in the center of its travel. About 10.5 inches of travel. So I'm going to push this back in until I have 5.25 inch from this flange to where the body of the cylinder is. Since our steering wheel is straight, our axle is straight, we'll put it on there that way. If we had it off the wrong amount, this thing would probably bottom out steering one way or the other. So we need to make sure that our steering is in the center of its travel and our steering stabilizer is in the center of its travel. Okay, so now this rod is in the center of its travel. The piston inside the cylinder is in the center. Our tie rod is in the center of its travel, so I know that our rod is going to move freely without this stopping at one end or the other. Okay, so here's our outward bracket for the stabilizer that we put on with the airbag mount. There'll be a bolt going through there. Stabilizer will go over it here with a nut on it. This could go either way. I prefer to put the rod towards the inside. A lot of the dirt and debris off the road you're picking up, if it beats on the shaft here, this shaft will get rough and it'll wear the seals out quicker. So it's a little bit more protected here in the center. It really makes no difference to how it mounts though. Alright, so the inner mount has 3 U-bolts and this plate. This is going to go right over the tie rod. Go ahead and put this bolt in. Tighten it up, leaving these U-bolts loose until I get my setting just right. Okay, now before I tighten this up on the tie rod, I'm going to double check that I have my 5 1/4 inches here. Yeah, see, it's moved on me a little bit already. So I'm just going to push this cylinder in. Yeah, there's 5 1/4 right there. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten these U-bolts up. Try to keep this cylinder perfectly parallel to the tie rod. That way it doesn't incur any binding as it goes through its travel. I'm tightening these in a sequence to help try to pull equal torsion on each end of these U-bolts. There, our steering stabilizer is completely installed. No plumbing, no other construction to be done to it. Now we've got all the air ride components installed. We go ahead and lift the truck, remove the jack stands, and get the front end back on the ground. We'll fire the truck up, build up some air, and check our ride height. So now we've got the truck on the ground. It's got air in the airbags. It's sitting at the height that we had set it. Now I'm just go down here and just make sure that we have the 2 1/2 inches that I originally had here. Looks like this side is good at 2 1/2. And we're here on the passenger side. We are about 2 3/4 on this side. So all I'll do here is adjust the angle of this leveling valve. That'll start venting out some air until I get to the height that I need. It'll be just a very small adjustment, but we could adjust this up or down if needed. Right there. I'm gonna tighten them back up. There we are. We can just check here on the top of the fenders. Originally, at our ride height, we were 45 1/4. And now we're 41 even on this one. And this is up at ride height. This is not dumped. Our driver's side was 44 3/8. Look, we evened it out also. 41 even on this side. So we've dropped this altogether, average about 3 1/2 inches at ride height. All right, so now we're gonna wire up a switch to control our solenoid for the front air. Now, if we had a older truck, we may have had an air rocker switch we could have used and bypassed, not needed to have the air solenoid at all. But in the case of this one, or maybe your truck too, you're going to have no air switches available, but you have some spare electric switches. In the case of this 2024 truck, they've got the new style switches, and they're not a traditional 12 volts in, 12 volts out kind of switch. These all go through a VECU, so we don't want to mess with the truck's computer system. So what we're going to do is bring battery power in from under the hood to a switch and an output going down to our solenoid. All right, so we're going to get power from under the hood to feed our new fuse block and our accessory power switches to run the air ride and the flip bumper. So here on the firewall on this truck, there is a power point where there's battery power coming up to it. I'll tie into this run a line inside the cab for our fuse panel, and from there we'll branch out and feed our switches. Yep, I'll just come off that right there though, that'll be perfect. That has a big fuse on it and a slightly smaller fuse that protects everything, and each circuit will have its own smaller fuse. So I built myself a little wire harness here to get my power from my power point to my fuse box, as well as from my switch down here into the box for the solenoids. So I'm going to feed this through this hole in the firewall. This is a good point to run wires through because there's not much in the way of it back here. So here's the other end of my harness. I'll have this one that'll feed my fuse box from the power point, and then the two others that'll come from the switches to control the bumper. So the red wire I'll designate as the air ride dump, and the blue will be for the bumper control. Alright, so now we're going to wire a switch up to control our solenoid, and you can use, if you have existing switches unused, this truck here with this new type of dash, we're not going to use these switches just because these all go through the VECU and we don't want to cause problems with the truck's computer. So we have a blank panel here that we're going to put holes into and add our switch for our air ride and for our flip bumper when we do it. Alright, so I've got a couple of universal rocker switches here that I'm going to put in this panel. If you wanted to use existing spare switches here, I'd get with your Peterbilt dealership and have them work with you to make those switches usable for your accessories. These are the wires I ran from my additional fuse box I added, and the other two wires are going down to the solenoids for the bumper and for the air ride. So I'll go ahead and put me some terminal ends on here for the switches, and I've not hooked up a power supply yet, so I'm confident that I'm not going to have any issues while working on these wires. Our switches are hooked up. Make sure they're off. Now I'll go back under the hood and hook up our power supply wire. Alrighty, now we're ready to make sure our switch operates like we need it to. Alright, this one here will be our dump. There we are. And it'll stay dumped until I turn the switch off. The amount of draw that solenoid pulls is pretty low, so it's not a major thing. You could probably leave it energized for a few hours without it pulling any drain on the battery. Alright, so now we've got everything put together up in the dash. Our final step is to check for air leaks. Some leaks are audible. You can hear them hissing out of a fitting or an airline, but for most of them you're going to need something like soapy water. We'll just use a bottle of spray soapy water and we'll spray on all of our fittings and look for bubbles. So obviously we've got a bubble forming over here, so we've got a leak where this fitting is screwed onto the nipple on the airbag. So we'll tighten that up and get this leak fixed. I think that did it. Looks like we have no more bubbles now. Solenoid looks good, and here's our supply. We'll put our fitting in the tank here, so I want to double check that both the threaded fitting and the quick connect fitting neither have a leak. And those look good and solid also.
All right, gang, so we've got the new gen air suspension drop kit fully installed, and what's kind of some big takeaways? I know we did this in about 8 hours or less.
Yeah, it's about a full day in the shop.
Yep.
We retained all the stability of the system, all the safety of it. We didn't remove any leaf springs. We're going to have a great ride quality, and we're going to be able to dump the truck.
All right, so we're at ride height now per the instructions, so let's take a measurement and then you can go up there and hit the deflate. So we're about 12 inches from the ground with this little tiny bumper now. And we're down to about 10.5. So with it set on the instruction specs for ride height, we've got about not quite 2 inches of drop. and we're going to take it out on a test drive, and we may raise that ride height up just a little bit, see how that goes. But nonetheless, here's your big gain out here. Look at the wheel well. Tire to wheel well gap is gone. So there's your cool factor and what everybody's striving for by the whole initiative of the deflates on the steer axle. So all in all, I'm pretty satisfied with this new gen. Some tips for those guys that may be buying it: paint the parts ahead of time, maybe before your truck's even going in the shop.
Yeah,
spray paint your parts.
If you get your parts, you get them spray painted, or if you got a custom colored frame, take it to a paint shop and have them do your paint match to your frame, or powder coat them, whatever your taste is. If you have a late model dash, like the digital dash of the new Peterbilt, might talk to Peterbilt about getting you some power accessory supply on those switches, or add a switch for it.
I guess if you had an older 389, you could go ahead and get your switch and your wiring down to this area.
Yeah, absolutely. You get a solenoid mount, you can get wires around to it before you ever tear into the truck at all.
Yeah. All in all, very satisfied with the new gen, and if you need them, you can get them at 4statetrucks.com. Just put in the part number below and we'll go from there.
Sounds great.
All right.